In the next couple of lessons, we're going to be talking about tied notes. So first, let's understand what ties are, how they work, and what they do. Using pages from my #1 bestseller book, The Best Music Theory Book for Beginners that sold over 5,000 copies. My name is Dan Spencer. I'm your music mentor. The full playlist with over 100 music theory lessons is in the video description. I recommend watching them in order. And now, back to the lesson. So ties connect notes together. Tied notes, when you tie two notes together, are worth the rhythmic value of both the notes connected by the tie. So let's say we have a quarter note, we tie it to another quarter note. 1 + 1 equals 2 beats or 2 counts. Let's say we have a half note tied to a quarter note. Half note gets 2 beats, 2 counts. Quarter note gets 1 beat, 1 count. Tie them together. You add them together. That's going to be 3 beats, 3 counts. So tied notes make the duration of notes longer by connecting the notes together. And interestingly, the second note of the tie does not get an attack. You're just going to hold it out like we did with the tas. Now, ties can connect notes in many ways. Number one, they can combine the rhythmic value of 2 or more notes in the same measure, but you're not going to see that in this book, and you're actually not even going to write that in this book or in your workbook. Number two, combine the rhythmic value of 2 or more notes in connecting measures. Now, this one you're going to see a lot of ties connecting notes from one measure to the next, both in your workbook and in this book and in this course. Number three, they combine the rhythmic value of 2 or more notes from one line of staff to another line of staff, and you will see that also in this course, in this book, and in your workbooks. Let's start off by taking a look at quarter notes tied to other notes and how many beats that would be worth. Let's zoom in here. Okay, so we have a quarter note tied to a quarter note. That's 1 + 1. That would equal 2 beats, 2 counts. Here's a quarter note tied to a half note. That's 1 + 2. That would equal 3. Half note tied to a quarter note. Same thing as a quarter note tied to a half note. 2 + 1 equals 3. Now, a quarter note tied to a dotted half. That's going to be 1 + 3. That's going to equal 4 beats or 4 counts. But remember, you're not actually going to put the ties in measures. You're only ever going to tie notes coming from one measure to another measure. So you're never going to write, for example, a quarter note tied to a dotted half note in one measure instead of a whole note. You just write a whole note because that's worth 4 beats, 4 counts. A dotted half note tied to a quarter note, that's 3 beats plus 1 beat. That equals 4 again. And a quarter note tied to a whole note, which would equal 5 beats or 5 counts, as the inverse as well. 4 beats, 4 counts for the whole note, plus 1 beat, 1 count for the quarter note equals 5 beats or 5 counts. Now let's look at some tied half notes. So if we tie a half note to a dotted half note, that's going to be worth 5 beats, 5 counts, because 2 + 3. The inverse is true. 3 beats plus 2, that's going to equal 5 beats. And again, these are not going to go in one measure. And then a half note plus a whole note, that's going to equal 6 beats. Same as the inverse. And you could also tie, for example, a dotted half note to a whole note to get 7 beats worth of time. So to give you an example, I'm actually going to taw through some of these with a metronome. Here's our 2 quarter notes tied together. This is what it sounds like. Ta. Right, 2 beats, 2 counts, and I don't taw the second one. Here's our quarter note tied to our half note. I'm going to taw through it. Ta. See, I didn't do another taw. There was no attack on the second note. I just hold the taw through it. Okay, and here is, well, let's do one over here. Let's do a quarter note plus a dotted half note. Ta. Right, because that's 1 + 3. That equals 4 total. Now let's do something from down here. Let's do a dotted half plus a half. Here we go. Ta. So 5 beats or 5 counts. For that, I will see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to have 2 parts to talk about how to write tied notes. First, I'm going to talk at you. I'm going to point to some things. Second, I'm actually going to go onto some staff paper and write it down in real time and talk you through it as I do it. So let's talk about tied notes on or above line 3, or the middle line of the staff. So number one, you're going to write notes you wish to connect with a tie on the same line or space of the staff. This is super important. Tied notes can only be on the same line or space of the staff as the other notes that they are tied to. Number two, you're going to write the tie from just above the first note head to just above the second note head. And we can see that, yep, sure enough, from measure 1 to measure 2, we have 2 quarter notes there. And then we write that tie arching over when it's above line 3. Now, tied notes below the middle line of the staff or tied notes below line 3, we're going to write the note heads or the notes you want to connect with a tie on the same line or space of the staff. Remember, you can only tie notes together when they're on the same line or space of the staff. Number 2, you're going to write the tie from just below the first note head to just below the second note head. So we can see, let's zoom in, right? We have 2 quarter notes, and then we have the 2 quarter notes connected with a tie from one measure to the next. And remember that in level 1, we're only ever going to be tying from one measure to the next. We're not going to be tying notes in a measure, in the same measure. All right, let's jump into some staff paper and let's write a couple examples. Okay, so here we are on some staff paper. We're just going to practice tying quarter notes to half notes, dotted half notes, and whole notes. No measures, no time signatures, no clefs. We're just going to practice writing the note heads, the stems, and then the ties. So we're going to start with, perhaps a quarter note on line 3 of the staff. Good stem. And we're going to tie that to a half note. Just like that. Then the tie arches over just above the first note head to just above the second note head. See, my line got a little squiggly there. It's okay if your lines get a little squiggly too. Okay, let's write now a quarter note to a dotted half note. Just doing the note heads. We're going to do this in space 2. Here's our quarter note. Now let's write a dotted half note. Dot. And because these note heads are below line 3 of the staff, we're going to tie under just below the first note head to just below the second note head. Excellent. Now let's practice tying to a whole note from a quarter note. So let's write a quarter note. You're on line 4 of the staff. And we're going to tie that to a whole note. Also, oops, I misspoke. I said line 4, I meant space 4. We're going to tie this quarter note to a whole note also in space 4. There you go. I will see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about the rules for using tied notes in measures. Now, first rule for tie notes is only use ties when you cannot use a note of a larger rhythmic value. Tie rule number 1 is you're only ever going to use a tie when a larger rhythmic value note cannot be used. So for example, you would never ever in a same measure tie a quarter note to a half note, because you could just write a dotted half note right there, because look, what we want here is 3 beats or 3 counts of sound. Ta. And the easier way to write that is just to put a dotted half note. So keep in mind, for level 1, we're only ever going to be looking for ties to go from one measure to the next measure. That's level 1. We're never going to be tying notes in measures, and that just has to do with the math of how the ties work out. It's not an arbitrary rule that I'm just making up for you. It's literally that there's no combination of beats for sound all in a row that you could make with a tie that you cannot do with either a quarter, half, whole, or dotted half note within a single measure. Now, ties cannot skip over rests. So you cannot tie a note to another note and skip over a rest. And remember that ties on or above line 3 of the staff arch over, whereas ties below line 3 of the staff arch under. So let's unpack some of these correct and incorrect examples. We already talked about this first one here. Now this is incorrect because, look, what do we want out of this? What we're essentially saying is we want beats 1, 2, and 3 to have sound, right? We want sound for beats 1, 2, and 3. And right now, that's what we've got. We got sound starting here, lasting through to here. But that's no good because we don't need ties and measures. All we need is for 3 beats of continuous sound to have a dotted half note. That's all you need. Right here. This one is incorrect because, okay, what essentially do we want to have happen here? Essentially what we want here is we want this note here to continue sounding all the way through to this note here. So, in other words, we want beats 1, 2, and 3 to have sound. Much easier way of doing that. If you want beats 1, 2, and 3 to have sound, just write a dotted half note. It's going to make your life a lot easier. So how do we write notes in connecting measures? Because that's what we're going to be doing primarily in level 1, is we're going to write ties from one measure to the next or from one line to the next. So we can see here that step number 1 is you write all the notes you want, including the notes you're going to tie together. And step number 2 is, yep, boom, you just add the tie. That's it. Now it gets a little bit more tricky, and something to pay attention to is writing a tied note from one line of the staff to the next line. So number 1, you're going to write your rhythmic composition. You're going to write out your notes. You're going to figure out where the tie is in your mind, and then you're going to show the beginning of the tie from the first line, and then you're going to show the end of the tie on the next line. See that? I'm going to zoom out so you can see the whole thing. So what we're saying is that this note right here lasts all the way through to here. So that's essentially a quarter note plus a whole note, which equals 5 beats or 5 counts. Award for the messiest quarter note and whole note goes to Dan Spencer. So you get the idea that it starts here. It starts in measure 4 and continues on into measure 5. So if I were to ta, I'm going to start tawing right here for measure 4. That's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 ta. So you can see that that ta starts here in measure 4, but it carries on for an additional 4 beats or 4 counts in measure 5. I will see you in the next lesson. This is going to be a little bonus lesson for how to tie more than 2 notes together. So I don't recommend you do this right away. As you start to incorporate ties into your rhythmic compositions, use them sparingly. Use 2 or 3 ties per 8 measures or 1 or 2 ties per 4 measures, because once you start getting into tie land, it gets real crazy and the notes start lasting for a really, really, really long time. So number 1, if you are going to tie more than 2 notes together, make sure that all the notes you are tying together are on the same line or space of the staff. Number 2, you're going to write ties showing that the notes are connected. And number 3, there's no limit technically for the number of ties that you can use in a row. So let's unpack this example a little bit because, well, it's a lot. So we have a total of 12 counts. Count them, 12 counts of tied notes here. So we start off with 3 counts with a dotted half note here, and then that's added to the 4 counts of the whole note, which is added to 4 counts of the whole note, which is added to 1 count of the quarter note. So 3 plus 4 plus 4 plus 1 equals 12. Now I'm going to take a real deep breath and ta this for you. Here we go. At 60. This is just an example. You don't need to ta this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ta. All right. So that's a lot. So you can do that in your composition. Just watch out and make sure you're using the ties correctly. You're not tying notes within the same measure to each other. You're only ever tying notes from one measure to the next measure or from one line to the next line. I will see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to be tying example 25 and 26 from the Best Music Theory book for beginners. We're doing it at 60. As you can see, we have our little 60 metronome sign there for our speed. Looking at the time signature, okay, it's 4/4, so the count-in's going to be for 4. Listening to the click, 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 ta. All right, this next one is 26. Again, 4 whole lines of music. Let's listen to the pulse. Again, at 60. Let's look at the time signature. Okay, time signature is a 3 on top, which means our count is going to be for 3. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Ta, 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 ta. I will see you in the next lesson. Oh, but it's not over yet. Click here to watch the next video lesson or up here for the full video playlist.